Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, to the Family Financial Conversation, and welcome, Suzanne, my co-host, my friend. I'm excited about our conversation today. How is the morning treating you so far?
Same, very well, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and one of the places that we wanted to zero in on today, you saw, everybody, the name of our podcast, The Trusted Contact Nothing Burger. And Suzanne, I've got to tell you, everybody, has taught me a lot about the origin of the trusted contact piece that comes out of all of our home offices, some of the logic behind it, how it came to market, and then really, what are advisors supposed to be doing with this? What are we really doing with this? And what might we be able to do in the future? Because a little bit of foreshadowing, I think when we're calling a podcast The Trusted Contact Nothing Burger, it sort of foreshadows that perhaps there might be a little bit more that we can do in the future. But let's go back to the beginning, Suzanne. Tell us a little bit about how Trusted Contact came about. What were the issues that institutions were wrestling with? And how did we get what we have right now?
Thank you. I'll dive into the deep end and say, I think it's a good example of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. And so FINRA 4512, which is Trusted Contact, was really meant to be a bolt-on to 2165. And 2165 allows for institutions where they suspect something untoward like financial elder abuse might be taking place to freeze accounts for a period of up to 15 business days. The problem with that was if somebody hadn't declared, let's say, a power of attorney, the institution kind of had its hands tied because they might know that something was going on, but they had nobody to talk to about whether the health of that individual in question was intact, whether they were still at home, etc. So you could argue, Tom, that Trusted Contact was really born of the fact that so few people place powers of attorney. And so Trusted Contact, my paraphrase here, is a little bit like a POA, but watered down. So in essence, what Trusted Contact requires institutions to do is to make, quote unquote, a reasonable effort to obtain a trusted contact who has to be just an individual that is 18 years of age or older upon account open for non-institutional accounts. And I'm spiking that out because upon account open does not necessarily address the fact that most of these people are going to have long-standing accounts.
Right.
That this rule does not necessarily cover. So it goes on to say, in essence, paraphrasing, that institutions then have to build some sort of process that allows them to really go in and try to make that reasonable effort to obtain a trusted contact on existing accounts in the course of normal business. But it specifically specifies they don't have to build anything new. And as we can probably imagine, reasonable efforts is really open to interpretation. Mm-hmm. So I start there to just say, while the intent may have been good, the outcome has not really helped, I would argue respectfully, to address the underlying issue. And that is the fact that people get older, they have diminished capacity, they are going to struggle a little bit more with making financial decisions. And this really doesn't go so far as to say we are going to require customers to put a power of attorney who can actually transact. And that gets me to the second, I'll call it deficit of the rule. A trusted contact can do things like verify your home address or share health-related information if they know it. They can't actually transact. And so at the end of the day, if the goal is to connect the institution with an individual who can really help ensure the best outcomes for that, let's say, elder client, this doesn't go far enough to do that. So I'm going to take a beat because I can see the wheels are turning on your side and ask you to weigh in on sort of the origin story, if you would, of Trusted Contact.
Well, I'll start with the two things that jumped out at me, Suzanne, was watered down and reasonable effort. And I'm not speaking for myself or any particular financial advisor, consultants, or institutions, but my observation is we in the advisor seat have a whole lot of different standards that we apply, whether we've had training on Trusted Contact or we haven't had training on Trusted Contact. You know, a lot of times this is yet another form that we got to fill out at account opening. If we're doing our job right, we should be making sure that there are successor decision makers on any of these accounts to begin with. And, in the absence of having successor decision makers through powers of attorney, because remember, all of these custodians are putting their own power of attorney forms in front of us all the time anyway, which is where we're trained on. And a lot of us are at a little bit of a loss about what is the utility for the advisor with this trusted contact effort, given that there is a wide range of training and resources. I think the other thing, when you're talking about watered down, a lot of our advisor audience members are thinking, listen, I only have 72 things to do today. And, I've got a client that may or may not be exhibiting some signs of cognitive issues, or, it's been a little bit of a difficult time getting a hold of them the last handful of quarters. But does it rise to the level of 3 phone calls in 3 quarters means that I've got to push the trusted contact button? And that's kind of weird because I don't know this person, or there's a family story behind it. And I don't feel an urgent obligation all of the time to make a reasonable effort. So I'm going to say reasonable effort, small r, with a lot of watered down things. And, certainly you can comment a little bit on, it's totally different if you're an advisor or a rep on a call center that comes in and there's black and white issues with a cognitive impairment and password problems or making multiple trades the same day. That's something very different than sometimes the very subjective role that advisors are sometimes forced to play with this trusted contact, not exactly a mandate. So what's your input on this? How come you think this isn't working for advisors, from the institutional perspective? Because I certainly can talk about what's happening around the water cooler.
Yeah, a lot there. And I think, it comes back to what resources are provided to the various levels of associates who may be involved with clients. I want to start with the call center, because for a client that might be struggling with diminished capacity, if a call center associate gets a password reset notification multiple times, they have a pretty good indication based on what is consistent industry training that there might be an issue. But then what's the follow-on to the advisor? So what resources does that associate have in the moment? Is there an individual who is actually trained in working with clients who may be suffering from diminished capacity, who can then join them on the phone, let's say in the moment, and help to gauge whether that individual client is in fact struggling with something? So I'm really harping there a little bit on the just-in-time resources, because the lack, I would say, across the industry of just-in-time resources for phone center, for advisors, is a key reason that this isn't working. That would be thing one, if you would. Thing two, I think, then goes into, if let's say that account then gets flagged and an advisor is notified, what is he or she supposed to do if there isn't a power of attorney on? So yeah, they can go ahead and reach out to the trusted contact and say, hey, I think we have a problem. To your point, they probably haven't met this person. They don't know what information the client may or may not have shared with them, including the fact that, having lived through this when it was implemented, there was a ton of client sensitivity around, I don't want, for example, my kid to know how much money I have. Well, under trusted contact, that information can be shared. So hand on heart, clients were reticent to put one on for that reason, among others. And then institutions get into, okay, how much do I actually need to share? And then I'll come back to what we both said a couple times, and that is great. Now I have a trusted contact who has, let's say, confirmed that this individual has some form of diminished capacity. They don't have power of attorney. They can't act on the client's behalf. So what is everyone then ultimately supposed to do? So all this to say, I think that, again, the intent might have been a good intent. The execution is the challenge, because at the end of the day, if this person can't transact, then everybody's hands are potentially tied. And what, again, is that advisor, to your point, who has 72 things on their desk to do, supposed to do then with this client in that moment?
I think that the imaginary just-in-time resource is wishful thinking in sort of today's list of resources that an advisor has. It's useful just to speak out loud the secret that advisors know, that when a household is flagged with cognitive impairment and there isn't a successor decision maker on file or that's easily accessible, I'll say it out loud. We know as advisors that the institution is looking to exit that account as soon as possible, that the liability associated with having cognitively impaired client and all the potential things that could go wrong with it, that's something that we see. And like when I talk to advisors in a number of different wirehouses, brokerages, and whatnot, there's some interesting conflicts of interest that sort of come up. You know, if I've got somebody with a cognitive impairment that's been flagged as a cognitive impairment, and I don't have a successor decision maker sort of on deck, I know that the institutional wheels are turning that are going to try to exit this client sort of out of my practice. And other than looking to conserve that and like plan ahead with trusted contact and do all this stuff and initial discovery and service models, the rest of it, I'm feeling penalized by not having all of the resources that I might need, either through point of contact where I'm doing discovery and getting the successor decision makers all the way through this trusted contact piece. But like on the other side of things, if I don't really, as an advisor, if I'm not really worried about new business, if I don't have like a net flows problem, this is sort of the first thing when we were thinking about the trusted contact nothing burger, I don't really have much of an incentive to do anything. You know, if I've got somebody that may or may not have some issues and I don't really know, and I'm not a social worker and I'm not paid extra for this, and this is probably going to leave my practice if it's flagged by the home office. But if I'm not really worried about net flows and I also have 200 other things to do today, I'm kind of maybe a shrug. Like if I'm not the advisor that is really compelled to do the right thing by the client for all of the appropriate ethical high road kind of things, if you're just looking very cynically as a devil's advocate, you know, I can see some advisors that are sort of a shrug on this. So the first sort of call to action advisor audience that I want you to think about is, how many times have you called a trusted contact on your list of clients in the last year? And my very informal homework that I've had is, of clients over age 75, maybe low single-digit percentages have I ever called a trusted contact at all. Let's remember, of course, that there's 7 million Americans with dementia right now. So there's a pretty big disconnect. Like, I'm not necessarily having the antenna that's going to pick up all of this different stuff. And the second thing that I would have the advisor audience think about, listen, if I'm not calling people on trusted contact, are any of the other advisors calling people? Because I don't have a whole lot of institutional support. I can't go into my CRM and say, hey, who are all of the trusted contacts for all of my clients that I can come up with a campaign to educate, to drip, those sorts of things. This whole thing is dumped on the advisor in terms of the responsibility, which is very frustrating. And in my mind, this is an area that institutions need to dramatically up their support game, initially for the advisor, but my goodness, for the client. You know, the big frustrating thing that I'll sort of close with is we as a profession, as a discipline, as a calling, have a handshake understanding with our clients who sometimes pay us a lot of money that we're supposed to bird dog areas of weakness and vulnerability in their financial lives. But this trusted contact thing, particularly with cognitive impairment, it's showing that, listen, sometimes when, you know, the stuff hits the fan, we're not compelled to act and we don't have the right tools. And that's particularly frustrating on my mind. Let me put that back to you. That's a lot to digest from a cynical and frustrated advisor standpoint. But how come we don't have more institutional support on this so far? Is it that the institutions don't care? Because I suspect they know.
Agreed. And, you know, a couple of thoughts there, Tom. Your cynicism is both, I think, appropriate, but also appreciated because that's born of the fact that you care. And most advisors care deeply about their clients, and they're frustrated by the fact that they don't have better resources. So I'll start with what the home office can do a better job of getting right. Making it easier to obtain trusted contact, to me, stems from explaining what the value is to the client. Right. And if you're going to start with trusted contact, explaining clearly what they can and cannot do, and then bolting it on immediately to power of attorney. And I get that it is complicated and it can be scary, but ultimately, if we all want to protect clients, then having them take that next step and declare that power of attorney makes everybody's lives easier and takes some work off the advisor's plate if and when they actually need somebody to act. The second point I would make is, why can't we identify trusted contacts as a field in Salesforce, which most institutions use, and run campaigns against it for the advisor?
I've never seen that. I've never seen that anywhere in 2024.
I have not either. And I'm asking the question because it seems to me that, look, if an institution is doing great and they have more business than they know what to do with, good on them. But for most individuals and for most institutions, I think organic growth is an issue. And it's an issue as older clients age out of their books. So why wouldn't we take an opportunity to start running proactive and reactive campaigns against identifying these people and actually encouraging them to plug in to the advisor and plug into the institution? And then lastly, we both touched on just in time. I know there are a few institutions that have done a really good job with this, but you're right, we're not doctors and we're not geriatricians. So in the spirit of protecting clients and advisors for that matter, why aren't there better just-in-time resources like people who have been trained and are actually experts in assessing whether somebody is struggling that can join that call center rep in the moment or join the advisor on a call if need be to make what is going to be an awkward conversation a little bit easier and not leave the client hanging. If we all are ultimately in this to do well by doing good, then why wouldn't we want to make sure that we can preserve those accounts by getting clients connected with the right resources? So all that to say, I think there's just a ton that can be done that is practical and actionable and would actually take maybe 2 or 3 of the 72 things that are on the average advisor's plates off their plate and help them do what they're good at doing.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that. I also, a little bit of homework assignment that I gave myself in prep for this, I went out and I read the trusted contact forms for like 6 or 7 different institutions. And that's a second call to action for my advisor friends that are listening. Why don't you read the whole thing? All right. And this is a piece that, again, maybe this is just old bald guy with a fist shaking at the sky, but this is terrible. All right. So I've got one in front of me from big brokerage that we all know. All right. So Suzanne, this is tongue in cheek, everybody. So settle down. But imagine, Suzanne, that you're my client, all right? And we have just gone through an ordeal where you've just lost your spouse after a long caregiving fight. And we're sitting down and trying to figure out who's next in line after you. So I'm talking to Suzanne, the widow, and I'm referencing, you're asking, like, what does the form actually say? Well, this is what it says. Suzanne, listen, I'm gonna use my advisor voice now. Ready? Suzanne, that was terrible. And I want to let you know that I've been thinking about what comes next with our planning, and I'd like to show you this trusted contact form. In the event that something happens and I notice that maybe you're less able, you're a victim of potential fraud or financial exploitation, you might not be able to handle your affairs, I want to let you know and assure you that this form tells you that I might do something, that there's a chance that I may or may not reach out to people on your trusted contact lists, that I recognize that it's not a power of attorney. So even if I reach out to them, we are agreeing that they can't do anything. But I also want to let you know that in the event that I don't reach out to anybody on the trusted contact, well, there really isn't anything that you or your family can do with me or the institution, because it says right here, you're releasing and discharging me and my institution from all claims against either contacting or not contacting anybody on your trusted contact list. So I want you to know that if we have to cross this bridge together, Suzanne, I'm going to be very interested in maybe helping out using this trusted contact form in a way that serves you. It's
I think
preposterous. That's what it says. Like, how about look at the straight face? Are you kidding? That's ridiculous.
Completely agreed. And I too read a number of these in advance of the call, and they're very similarly worded and clearly worded to benefit the institutions. And I have to believe Tom as an advisor and as somebody who is ex-home office, it puts the advisor in, to say the least, a very awkward position because you worked really hard to cultivate this relationship. And if anybody really read that, hopefully you would have the good grace to say, wow, I know my advisor, he would act in my best behalf and sort of ignore the home office language. But your points are extremely well taken, inflection included, and it does not cover the institution or the advisor in glory, and certainly as a client does not reinforce that, they are paying good money to have their assets looked after.
Yeah, so this as a standard it's pretty terrible. I think that for advisors that might share some of this frustration, when you think about how few trusted contacts that you're actually contacting proactively on your book, if you think about the home office doesn't make this any easier for us because we're kind of on an island. Maybe the webinar training that we had on trusted contact is enough for you, but it isn't enough for most people. I would offer this particular podcast should get circulated around to folks that are frustrated about a lack of institutional support being able to serve clients that are in transition, because we do not have enough just-in-time resources. There's way too much subjective judgment at a point of ambiguity that advisors are not trained for. Like, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a social worker, I don't get paid for this. I'm clearly absolved. Like, when I read this, even though there's some internal policies that say, I can't ignore obvious signs of cognitive impairment, like I have a duty to report and that sort of stuff. But in terms of a way that this is helping my client relationship and all that G2 retention and those sorts of things, remember, the trusted contact, this is what I train the rest of my team on. The trusted contacts are likely, hopefully, the same people that might be populating the secondary successor decision maker. Not necessarily, but at least it's a pretty good head start of maybe some extended family, maybe beneficiaries that might consider or not consider working with you. And I'm very sure if something happened to mom or dad and you never called when you should have known because this form stinks so much and the home office doesn't support you, there is close to 100% chance that they're not going to be working with you. That's something that is part of the theme of everything that we're doing on the Family Financial Conversation is how do we serve, but how do we serve in sort of a high ethics business case? How am I getting more organic wallet share? How am I improving the ability to consolidate? How am I improving my second generation retention? And this trusted contact is just not it. It is just not sufficient.
Couldn't agree more. Let me ask you this as a practitioner. How might you, or how are you in your practice moving past that which is the trusted contact, nothing burger, and getting more people to understand why the POA is so important to not just protect the client and your practice, but also to preserve the potential for that G2 or G3 relationship?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to answer that, and thanks for that. The first one is, for those in the audience that are getting to know me, I'm pretty self-evidently specializing in a lot of this stuff with seniors in transition and longevity and whatnot. So the things that I do, which I'm happy to share and keep talking about for as long as people are asking me, I'll enunciate in detail, but I also want to call attention to the fact that I'm a practice and an advisor that's been doing this for 25, 30 years. I have some scale. I have a team of 10. This is not me doing it by myself. And I've had to do this absent what I consider appropriate home office support. So to some degree, I'm kind of left to my own devices. And there are other thought leaders and very proactive advisors out there that are doing the same thing. To answer your question directly, the things that I do is I am engaging the clients and their clients' children or successor decision makers. I won't go so far as to say I don't take clients unless successor decision makers are identified, but I am actively looking to have that loose end taken care of very, very quickly. And we don't let it go. We've got relationships with professionals that can serve in that capacity. On my firm, we're developing in-house trustee capabilities, so we'll have some option. That doesn't answer the healthcare question, but in my mind, the big thing that I'm trying to do is on a very sort of psychosocial level first. I'm trying to make the case that once a healthcare event, a change in housing is required, a change in cognition is detected, that I'm trying to get my families to understand your priorities are going to change. The things that were the most important things to you before are now no longer the most important things. And I want to foreshadow that. And I want to ask about family circumstances where they sort of know this to be true. The idea of, a life of leisure and vacationing with my grandchildren as the most important thing might change very quickly to, I want to stay at home no matter what. And that might change very quickly to, I want to stay with my spouse even if I can't stay at home, no matter what. That's the new most important thing. Then you move on to whatever it takes. I want to manage a dignified, and comfortable dying process. And each of those successive things at this particular chapter in life, they hijack all of the other financial priorities. And the more that we can articulate as advisors that the bullseye that we're aiming all of our financial strategies on, it's not a static bullseye. It changes. And to be able to enlist family members, trusted contacts, successor decision makers, people that can say no but can't say yes, the difference between people that can make healthcare decisions and property decisions. We need to get everybody on the same page and align around priorities first. And Suzanne, what I do is by getting the priorities articulated and an acknowledgement that those priorities can change over circumstances, then what I've done is I've set up, psychologically speaking, I've set up the dog that wags the financial tail. We're in agreement that the portfolio strategy, that the cash flow strategy, that the tax strategy is supporting what we now have consensus on as the most important thing. And then we get the pencils out and we nerd out and do our stuff with the portfolio and the cash flow and the tax side of things. That's some of the wilderness that I've had to sort of traverse on my own. And I'd like to think that with a platform like the Family Financial Conversation, those type of psychosocial framings can really help us overcome this bumblefest of things like trusted contact, where I don't know how to talk about it. I'm not getting a whole lot of home office support. Maybe I'm reactively, if I have to, reach out to somebody because I care, not because I have to. Like, we have to come up with sort of a different, I'm coming all the way back to where you started. There has to be a different value proposition that our industry, that us as advisors are offering our clients. And they expect us to have answers and to be present when things get hard. And this trusted contact nothing burger is sort of evidence in my mind that that's not the major motivator for the institutions that came up with this watered down thing that's meant to support advisors.
Right. Completely agree and appreciate your articulation, but also I think recognition that you're in a position because of your practice type to do some things that all advisors might not be able to. Last question from me on the topic. What you just articulated is, I'm going to say, potentially a proactive solution where you're having conversations ideally in advance of the event. You and I and others have talked a lot about the fact that that oftentimes doesn't play out, meaning you can't engage proactively. So I'm going to flip the question and say, when you already know there's an issue and you do not have the latitude to have that proactive engagement and you and the family are in reactive mode, how might your description of that process change? And what tips would you offer to listeners who are in the thick of it?
Oh, that's a really good question. So even though best practice, I try to do all this proactive stuff, you're absolutely right. 80% of the time, some link of the chain breaks in ways that, even though we might have talked about it or not, everybody's on their heels and nobody's done this before and it's sort of a scramble fest. I think the most important thing in that moment is you've got to figure out what the healthcare and the housing priorities are first. And advisors need to recognize that they might not be in the professional seat to be able to have huge influence on where your clients are going to land on that, which is part of the reason, Suzanne, that advisors often find themselves as bystanders. Like, that I am not equipped and I'm not in the room when everybody's deciding what happens. And then I got maybe a new decision maker who I may or may not have contacted through trusted contact now telling me the new rules of the money, and I'm kind of out of it from a relationship standpoint. The most important thing to do is to be as present as possible, shoulder to shoulder with your clients and their new decision makers about what the new important priority is. And, mirroring is sort of a skill from a sales standpoint and an advice standpoint that a lot of us have had. I would encourage everybody to mimic one thing that I do. I repeat back what the clients tell me their most important thing is all the time, because this is a new priority for them, but they've got muscle memories on maybe a lifetime of priorities that's aimed their financial behaviors in different directions. So it supports them by saying, like, Suzanne, you're my client. I know we talked about the vacation home, but that's not the thing that we said was important right now. What we said was important right now is we need to give ourselves some cash flow elbow room because we don't know what's going to happen after the next doctor visit. And we need to just give ourselves some more liquidity. Like, right. That's my new priority. So you got to reactively identify and articulate out loud with the least ambiguity possible, allowing for ambiguity, but what is the most important thing for the clients, where they sit right now, sometimes with incomplete information and under a lot of stress. And you need to play that back to the client. They need to know that their bogey, their goals, their priorities are moving, that you're present with them trying to figure it out, and that everything that's happening with your advice, presumably I'd like to think most of us are fiduciaries, but even on a best interest standpoint, everything that is going to be coming out of my mouth in terms of advice for clients in the moment reactively is serving this new priority. It's not serving my old client in the old stuff that we used to talk about. That's part of the reason that I harp so much on the idea that you have to initiate discovery again. You have to initiate discovery again. When the healthcare thing happens, it is not your old client. You have a new client now with new priorities, new decision-making, and like basically new rules of money. That's, I think, that the guidance that I would give. And I'd like to think that whenever, things that can't go on forever, don't. Institutions can't play short shrift with these issues with an aging population forever. And I'd like to think some of these things, some of these ideas, and I'm not the only one that has these ideas, trickle into best practices to better serve advisors in the moment and not leaving them sort of out on an island with a pretty weak-looking form.
Agreed. Super powerful. And I would also add, again, we're talking to advisors here, but clients have a lot of power too, and so do those children. And I think it's a shame, and hopefully this tide will turn, that more consumers are not demanding more and better. Not just G1 and G2, but G3 too, because again, at the end of the day, these are the things that protect people's dreams and what is most important to them. And I think the whole industry and its clients deserves better.
Yeah, well said. Well, I will wrap up. We're coming up on time. I'll wrap up with sort of my last call to action. And that's really for the institutions that are serving the advisors. Like, do better. This isn't enough. And I think for the advisors that might agree with me, socialize this podcast. You can find us obviously on Advisorpedia. You see the links on how you're able to access this. This is something Suzanne and I feel real passionate about. And I triple dog dare you to read your trusted contact form and not get as animated as we are right here. Everybody, thanks very much for joining us. Suzanne, thank you for your leadership and trusted contact as it was years ago. And I appreciate again your ongoing positive influence for all of us. Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered in the podcast represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure. Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.